Railways have been the lifeblood of Russia for decades. From the Tsarist era to the Soviet Union, and then to today's Russian Federation, these lines have been the country's most critical logistical backbone. For the Russian army, railways were not just a means of transportation, but rather the invisible nerve network of war. Everything from tanks to artillery, ammunition to soldiers, reached the front lines via these rails. However, this strategic advantage has now become a weakness for Russia. These rails, which once carried the empire's burden, are now targets of Ukrainian sabotage. The most destructive link in this chain of sabotage struck the Leningrad region. At 2:30 a.m. on September 14th, a huge explosion occurred at the Stroganovo Mshinskaya crossing. This explosion not only broke the tracks, but also derailed the freight train traveling on them. The locomotive overturned, and 15 fuel tanker cars caught fire. The dark Leningrad night suddenly turned into day. Videos taken by locals showed flames rising meters into the sky, spreading like an orange curtain, and the sound of the explosions could be heard from miles away. The fire was so large that fire crews had to struggle for hours to bring the flames under control. As images shared on social media circulated across Russia, military logistics analysts came to the same conclusion. This attack was not just sabotage, it was a direct blow to the fuel supply chain heading to the front lines. However, the Leningrad regional governor claimed in his initial statement that the tankers were empty. Ukrainian intelligence sources, however, argued the opposite. The magnitude of the explosions, the heat, and the prolonged fire indicated that the wagons were full. These conflicting statements alone revealed how much discomfort the attack caused in Moscow. Another factor triggering this unease was the lack of an official explanation of how the operation was carried out. However, the available data and expert analysis point to three critical scenarios. The first and most frightening scenario is that a small elite Ukrainian Special Forces unit infiltrated Russian territory for hundreds of kilometers and planted explosives at the target. If true, this operation would not only be sabotage, but proof of a major weakness in Russia's border security and its internal intelligence network. The second scenario involves a long-range unmanned aerial vehicle being directed to predetermined GPS coordinates and making a kamikaze dive onto a junction or a critical bridge segment. Such an operation would demonstrate that Ukraine now possesses the technological capacity to threaten even Russia's most strategic depths. The third and most disturbing scenario is the possibility that this sabotage was carried out by partisan groups within Russia, coordinated by Ukrainian intelligence. If so, this is not just a war between two countries. It also signifies a growing internal conflict between the Kremlin regime and its own citizens. This is perhaps Putin's worst nightmare, the enemy being inside the very lands he believes are under his control. Whichever scenario is correct, one fact remains unchanged. That night, not only did a train derail on the Moscow-St. Petersburg line, but the Kremlin's narrative of a secure homeland also derailed. Moreover, a series of events undermining this narrative has been unfolding for weeks. On the night of September 13th, Russia's strategic backbone, its railway network, was virtually paralyzed. Federal railway traffic came to a near standstill, particularly on the Orel Kursk line. The events between Maloarkhangelsk and Glazunovka were the trigger for this collapse. According to official sources, railway workers discovered a suspicious mine device along this route. An engineering team affiliated with the National Guard was then dispatched to the scene. Unfortunately, however, a major explosion occurred during a mine clearance operation that did not go as planned. 2 security guards were killed, and another lost both legs. That same night, Russian railways were forced to divert many freight trains from their routes. It was reported that more than 15 trains in both directions were either delayed or rerouted. Orel regional governor Andrei Klitschkov was forced to acknowledge the disruptions. However, in order to stay in line with the Kremlin, he carefully avoided using the word sabotage. Meanwhile, social media was flooded with images of the fire. Videos showing the flames turning night into day revealed not only the severity of the incident, but also that the Russian people were beginning to speak out more and more against such events. But perhaps even more worrying is that these acts of sabotage are not only damaging supply lines behind the front lines. The real danger is that it shows the war must be fought not only against an external enemy, but also against an internal uprising. One of the most striking examples of this situation occurred in the Karachay-Cherkess Republic, part of the Russian Federation. The pro-Ukrainian resistance network Atesh announced that it had attacked a relay cabinet on the railway in the North Caucasus and completely disabled the signaling system. The partisans stated that this line was used specifically to transfer ammunition and vehicles from industrial facilities in the North Caucasus to the Rostov region. The effects of these 3 sabotage attacks were not limited to blowing up a few rails. The military consequences began to be felt in a chain reaction. St. Petersburg is one of Russia's largest military-industrial clusters. Many advanced technologies are produced here, from electronic warfare systems to radar optics, precision-guided missiles to command and control systems. The first stop for these products to reach the front lines is usually the military logistics centers in Moscow. The blocking of the Petersburg-Moscow line meant that these valuable cargoes had to be either rerouted or suspended. Alternative routes were both longer and riskier. Delays could last for weeks. Spare parts for electronic defense systems used against HIMARS, Storm Shadow, and other long-range attacks at the front were directly affected by this delay. This created the risk of breaking the resistance at the front. However, the cargo carried by this route was not only military. The economic lifeline also ran along the same tracks. This corridor serves as the main freight artery to major Baltic ports such as St. Petersburg and Ust-Luga. Oil, coal, fertilizer, metal, and countless other raw materials pass through these tracks to reach the ports. The halt in traffic after the explosion meant that loading schedules were disrupted, ships had to wait longer in port, and demurrage penalties came into effect. Factories waiting for raw materials slowed down production, deliveries were delayed, and foreign currency inflows were disrupted. In other words, the train that left the rails reverberated not only in Leningrad, but also on the Moscow Stock Exchange, in the factory fields of Rostov, and even in export contracts extending to China. But the deepest rupture occurred in the psychological realm. For years, the Kremlin had been telling the public that the war was only being fought within Ukraine's borders, and that Moscow and St. Petersburg were safe. But on the night of September 14th, this narrative collapsed. The war was no longer just in Donetsk, Kupiansk, or Melitopol. It had become a threat felt in the suburbs, at the station, in the backyard. Instead of the cold language of television news, people were talking about the heat of the fire seen from the window. A feeling that nowhere is safe began to spread. This was not just fear, but also a crisis of confidence. The weaknesses of the state's security apparatus raised questions about how such a strategic line could not be protected. This pressure gave Rosgvardia and the FSB a new task: to leave the front and protect the rear lines. Tens of thousands of personnel were assigned to secure thousands of kilometers of railway network. Some units that should have been fighting at the border were now stationed between Petersburg and Moscow. This meant that the Kremlin was now forced to withdraw its forces from the front line to prevent the war from spilling over. In other words, the impact of sabotage was not merely technical. It was a structural upheaval that even reversed strategic priorities. Belgarod is not just a border city for Russia. It is one of the nerve centers of the war corridor extending to the Kharkiv and Sumy fronts in northeastern Ukraine. Looking at the map, the railway line extending south from Moscow widens in Belgarod, where it becomes a major staging ground for fuel, ammunition, tanks, and personnel. Nearly all of Russia's offensive plans on the northern front depend on this logistical axis, because the war is now won or lost not only on the front lines, but also on the road to the front. That is why Ukrainian intelligence and special forces have developed a comprehensive sabotage strategy against this line. Ukraine's GUR unit, coordinating with local partisan groups, identified the weakest links on the Moscow-Belgorod railway. Unmonitored crossings, bridges, switch points, and signal boxes all became potential targets. These points were vital, like the nerve endings of a living organism, and when severed, not only did the train stop, but an entire army came to a halt. These acts of sabotage had an immediate impact, but their consequences could last for weeks. For example, a single explosive device placed on the tracks could immobilize a military convoy consisting of kilometers of armored vehicles, artillery, T-72 tanks, and fuel tankers. These convoys would not only come to a halt, but would become exposed targets for the enemy. Fixed targets identified by satellite imagery were now inevitable strike points for HIMARS missiles and FPV drones. Each disruption on the train line forced the Russian army onto roads, making these new routes even more fragile, longer, and deadlier. When the symbolic blow to Leningrad, the military paralysis in Belgarod, and the internal insurrectionary fire in the Caucasus are brought together, Ukraine's genius and the strategic trap Russia has fallen into become clear. This is one of the most brilliant examples of modern asymmetric warfare, dubbed the Railway War. Ukraine has managed to turn its enemy's greatest strength, its vast territory and the enormous railway network connecting it, into its greatest weakness, despite facing an adversary with military and economic power many times its own. The beauty of this strategy lies in achieving maximum impact with low-cost actions. A few kilograms of explosives, or a well-trained sabotage team of just a few people, can halt billions of dollars in trade, paralyze an entire army group logistically, and devastate a nation's psyche. This is a war of attrition in which Ukraine, with its limited resources, is imposing a disproportionately high cost on Russia. More importantly, this strategy is pushing the Russian general staff into an unsolvable dilemma. They face a terrible choice. Will they use their best troops and security personnel to protect the tens of thousands of kilometers of railway lines stretching from Siberia to the Caucasus? Or will they send these troops to Ukraine, where they are desperately needed to stem the bleeding on the front lines? The cost of either option is heavy. Every soldier assigned to protect a bridge is a soldier who cannot defend a trench in Donbass. This is a perfect strategic trap that drains resources, gives Ukraine complete initiative, and leaves the Russian command constantly reactive and defensive. This railway war also works in perfect synergy with Ukraine's attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure. As a result, the explosions reverberating along Russia's steel arteries are not only derailing trains, they are also derailing the Kremlin's war strategy and Putin's myth of a stable, powerful Russia. Russia's geographical depth, seen as its greatest strength, and the railway network that spans this depth, have become its greatest vulnerability in the face of Ukraine's bold and intelligent strategy. The war is no longer just a special military operation taking place in Ukraine's distant plains. It has turned into a series of time bombs that could explode anywhere at any moment, from Moscow to the Caucasus, in the very heart and veins of Russia itself. These attacks demonstrate that Ukraine possesses not only the will to survive, but also the intelligence and audacity necessary to win the war. Every explosion on the tracks means one less Russian unit on the front line firing bullets, consuming fuel, and losing a little more faith in victory. It seems that the fate of this war will be decided not only under the tracks of tanks, but also along those steel rails stretching across Russia's vast territories. And the creaking sounds on those rails could be the harbinger of an empire's collapse. Thank you for watching.